Congresswoman Crockett, Posner sneered, his voice dripping with the superiority of a man who believed every word he uttered was carved in stone. It must be hard for someone with your background to keep up with serious legal thought. Don't worry, we'll keep it simple for you. For a moment, the room tilted with the weight of his insult. A few muffled chuckles escaped from his corner, the kind of laughter that feeds arrogance. But then, silence. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't snap back, didn't blink, didn't even raise her eyebrows. She simply stared at him, eyes steady, a calmness so sharp it cut through the room like glass. It wasn't weakness, it was patience. And it was terrifying. The camera lingered on her face, capturing the quiet before the storm. That pause, those endless seconds, felt like the entire chamber was holding its breath. And in that stillness, something shifted. The power that Posner thought he had claimed began slipping through his fingers, unseen but undeniable. What you are about to witness isn't just an argument. It isn't just a clash of personalities or ideologies. No, this is the moment arrogance collided head-on with dignity, and dignity refused to back down. Because behind that calm stare is more than just a congresswoman. It's the history of struggle. The weight of voices long dismissed. The fire of communities told they don't belong. Crockett's silence wasn't emptiness. It was the gathering of storms, the tightening of a spring, the moment before a hammer falls. And across from her sat Richard Posner, cloaked in decades of authority, convinced that intellect alone could insulate him from accountability. He believed he was untouchable. He believed this exchange would be another notch in his belt, another demonstration of his wit. What he didn't realize was that, in trying to humiliate her, he had already overplayed his hand. The stage was set, one side armed with arrogance, the other with poise and truth. One trying to belittle, the other refusing to shrink. And as the silence grew heavier, as the audience leaned forward, waiting for the spark, a question filled the air like static. Who would move first? And what would happen when dignity finally struck back? To understand why Richard Posner thought he could belittle Jasmine Crockett, you have to step back and look at the world he came from. For decades, Posner was seen as the towering figure of American legal thought, a judge whose words could shake courtrooms, whose wit could silence challengers. He wore his brilliance like armor and wielded it like a weapon. Colleagues called him a genius. Critics called him ruthless. But beneath the praise and the power was a pattern, a man who mistook sharpness for superiority and intellect for license to demean. In Posner's universe, the game was always the same: identify the weakest link in the room, slice them open with sarcasm, and walk away to applause. He thrived on control. He thrived on reminding others that he had read more books, written more opinions, mastered more citations than anyone else. And in the insulated halls of academia and the judiciary, this arrogance had few challengers. For years it worked. But across from him now stood Jasmine Crockett, and to Posner, she looked like just another easy target. A black woman, an unapologetic progressive, a freshman congresswoman from Texas who had risen through grassroots grit, not ivy-covered institutions. To him, she was someone to be put in her place, a chance to remind the room and himself that his authority remained untouchable. What Posner never understood was that the world had changed, and the old tricks, the sneers, the smirks, the intellectual bullying no longer landed the same way. Crockett wasn't just another politician. She was forged in a different fire, raised in a world where doors slammed before she could knock. She learned to pick herself back up with defiance, not despair. In every courtroom where she defended the vulnerable, in every committee where she battled dismissive colleagues, she carved out a reputation not for elitism but for fearlessness. Her strength wasn't in belittling others, it was in speaking truths that made the powerful squirm. That's what made this clash so combustible. On one side, a relic of an era when arrogance went unchallenged. On the other, a woman who embodied the resilience of communities tired of being told to wait their turn. One clung to his crown, the other carried the voices of people he never cared to hear. Posner thought he was stepping into another debate he could dominate with ease. But Crockett saw more than just a sparring match. She saw a chance to expose something bigger, the hollow core of elitism, the arrogance that dresses itself in intellect but collapses when confronted with dignity. The audience may not have realized it yet, but the stakes of this exchange were immense. It wasn't just about words traded in a hearing. It was about the clash between the past and the future, between power that bullies and power that serves. And here's the part that Posner didn't see coming. The cameras were rolling. Every smirk, every insult, every pause was being captured, broadcast, magnified. His sneer wasn't confined to the walls of that chamber. It was spilling out into millions of screens, millions of hearts. What happened in those next few moments wouldn't stay in the room. It would ripple through timelines, hashtags, news cycles. Because when arrogance underestimated dignity, the world got to watch. And when the cameras rolled, everything changed. For decades, Richard Posner was hailed as a titan of American jurisprudence. His rulings carried weight. His essays were quoted in classrooms, and his name was synonymous with intellectual rigor. He was the kind of figure who appeared in law school syllabi, not as a footnote, but as a headline to the public. He was a symbol of brilliance, sharp, prolific, impossible to ignore. But behind that brilliance lived something else, a streak of disdain so deep it often overshadowed his achievements. Posner built his reputation not only on ideas, but on the performance of superiority. In lecture halls, he mocked students who stumbled over answers. In debates, he dismissed opponents not with counter-arguments, but with cutting remarks designed to humiliate. Even his judicial opinions sometimes read less like reasoned judgments and more like verbal beatdowns. His genius was undeniable, but so was his arrogance. This arrogance was not confined to tone. It seeped into the very heart of his worldview. He styled himself a pragmatist, a realist who valued efficiency over sentiment. To some, that sounded refreshing. To others, it was a mask for cruelty. He questioned long-established protections, minimized civil rights claims, and treated moral arguments as sentimental distractions from rational policy. It was brilliance weaponized, intellect used not to elevate, but to belittle. And yet, Posner often contradicted his own creed. For all his claims to cold, hard rationality, he was driven by ego as much as evidence. He claimed to despise ideology, yet his opinions dripped with personal biases. He championed free markets, but often ignored the human cost. He criticized emotional arguments, but his own rhetoric was steeped in derision, mockery, and the theater of insult. The hypocrisy was glaring. The man who claimed to stand above pettiness was often its loudest practitioner. Over time, this duality became his brand. Admirers excused the arrogance as the price of genius. Critics saw it for what it was, the mask slipping, the truth that brilliance without humility corrodes into cruelty. And when Posner left the bench, his legacy carried both triumphs and scars, innovative legal thought on one side, a trail of belittled colleagues and wounded reputations on the other. It was this legacy that he carried into every public appearance. He was used to being the smartest man in the room, and he wanted you to know it. He spoke with the cadence of a man convinced he was untouchable, insulated by decades of acclaim. To many, it was impressive. To others, infuriating. And that is the Richard Posner who sat across from Jasmine Crockett, a man who believed that his reputation alone was enough to overpower her, a man who mistook arrogance for authority and contempt for cleverness. To him, this was supposed to be easy, one sharp jab, one cutting insult, and the freshman congresswoman would be left flustered, exposed, diminished before a national audience. But what Posner had not accounted for was the shifting tide. The era in which his kind of arrogance went unchallenged was fading. The public had grown wary of elites who mocked rather than listened, who belittled rather than built. And Crockett was no ordinary opponent. She had faced down dismissive prosecutors, dismissive colleagues, dismissive institutions her entire career. She had learned to endure condescension and turn it into fuel. As Posner prepared to unleash his sharpest line, the one he believed would draw laughter and solidify his dominance, he had no idea the stage had changed. He was stepping into a new era, one in which arrogance was no longer admired, but dissected, exposed, and demolished in real time for millions to see. But little did he know, his sharpest jab would be the blade that cut his own credibility to pieces. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in marble courtrooms or ivory towers. It begins in the neighborhoods of Texas, where she grew up surrounded not by privilege, but by grit. Her childhood was shaped by the ordinary struggles that millions of Americans know too well. working parents, tight budgets, and the unspoken challenge of navigating a world that doesn't always open doors for people who look like her. She wasn't born into the circles of power. She clawed her way toward them, armed only with determination, intelligence, and the unshakable conviction that she belonged. From a young age, Crockett understood what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers doubted, peers whispered, and society imposed ceilings. But instead of breaking her, those doubts became the steel in her spine. She excelled in school, not because it was easy, but because she refused to let anyone else write her story. Every A she earned was a rebuttal, every achievement a declaration. You will not define me by your limitations. When she chose law, it wasn't the safe choice. It was the brave one. She didn't pursue prestige firms or corporate corridors. She went where the need was greatest. In Dallas, she became a public defender, fighting for those who couldn't afford high-priced representation. In dingy courtrooms filled with people society had discarded, Crockett stood tall. She wasn't polished in the way elite attorneys expected, but she was relentless. She listened to her clients, saw their humanity, and fought for them with every ounce of energy she had. Her reputation grew, not as the lawyer who wore the sharpest suits or dropped the fanciest citations, but as the lawyer who wouldn't back down. Judges noticed her grit. Colleagues respected her fight. Communities began to rally around her, seeing in her a reflection of themselves, someone who understood the struggle because she had lived it. When she entered politics, she carried that same authenticity. No filters, no disguises, no pandering. In committee hearings, she spoke with the rhythm of someone who had sharpened her voice in courtrooms where everything was on the line. She asked the questions others avoided. She called out hypocrisy when it was right in front of her. And unlike many of her colleagues, she didn't cloak her words in politeness when injustice was at stake. It didn't take long for viral clips of her fiery takedowns to spread across social media. Viewers watched her stand up to colleagues who thought they could bulldoze her with volume or titles. They saw her refuse to shrink, even when she was the youngest voice in the room. And every time she spoke, it wasn't just her voice. It was the echo of millions who had been dismissed, disrespected, and told to wait their turn. That is what makes Jasmine Crockett dangerous to men like Richard Posner. He represents the world of old power, where intellect was weaponized against those without access, where elitism masqueraded as truth, where cutting someone down was considered brilliance. She represents the new guard, voices forged in the margins, carrying scars that double as armor, unwilling to let arrogance go unchallenged. Her rise was not about privilege but persistence. Every committee seat, every headline, every moment in front of the cameras was earned, not inherited. She didn't just bring herself to that chamber. She brought the weight of the people who believed in her, people who wanted someone who wouldn't bow to condescension. And so, when Richard Posner looked across the room at her, he didn't just see a congresswoman. He saw a woman who embodied everything he had spent a career dismissing: authenticity over elitism, empathy over arrogance, resilience over pedigree. To him, she was an easy mark. To her, he was just another obstacle, one she was uniquely prepared to dismantle. Because her silence, her stare, her calm composure in that opening moment wasn't weakness. It was the patience of someone who had been here before, someone who had heard worse, endured worse, and still emerged stronger. She had faced insults laced with condescension her whole life, and each one only sharpened her resolve. This wasn't just another debate for her. It was the collision of two worlds: the arrogance of a man who thought brilliance excused belittling, and the dignity of a woman who carried the voices of those he had ignored. And on this day, all of that firepower would converge at the perfect moment. The silence broke not with Crockett's voice, but with Posner's. He leaned forward, his glasses sliding down his nose, his words sharp and calculated. "You see, Congresswoman," he said, his tone heavy with mock sympathy. The problem here is that you're trying to grasp legal nuance with the blunt tools of politics. Law is not about feelings, it's about reason. And frankly, your reasoning is, well, let's just say it's lacking. There it was again. The sneer, the smirk, the performance of superiority. He wasn't debating. He was lecturing as though the cameras were his classroom and Crockett his unwilling pupil. Every word dripped with condescension. Every pause invited laughter at her expense. And though a few murmurs of approval came from his side, the larger room sat in uneasy stillness. Crockett did not flinch. She didn't rush to fill the silence after his jab. She let it sit there, heavy, suffocating, until the smugness of his words began to sour. That silence was her shield, her strategy. And in that silence, the audience began to shift. What Posner thought was triumph began to look like arrogance laid bare. But Posner couldn't stop himself. He interrupted her as she opened her mouth, cutting across her words with a wave of his hand. No, let me finish. I wouldn't expect you to understand how precedent truly operates. It's far too complex to reduce to slogans. Again, that smirk. Again, that arrogance. He believed he was untouchable, the master of the stage. To him, Crockett was nothing more than a prop in his performance, a foil to highlight his intellect. Yet Crockett's calm never wavered. Her eyes didn't flicker with anger. They glowed with something sharper. Patience, precision, inevitability. She leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable, giving him the rope he didn't realize he was wrapping around his own neck. The tension in the room thickened. Every interruption, every mockery, every flourish of Posner's supposed brilliance made his arrogance clearer, more suffocating. The audience watching at home felt it too. They knew this posture. They had seen it in bosses who dismissed them, professors who mocked them, politicians who waved away their pain. Posner wasn't just attacking Crockett. He was embodying every insult ever hurled at those deemed less than. And still, Crockett waited. Her silence wasn't retreat. It was a storm gathering behind calm skies. The cameras caught it. The steadiness in her breathing, the quiet confidence in her posture. Where Posner radiated smugness, she radiated inevitability. Finally, after another long-winded boast disguised as a lecture, Posner leaned back in his chair, convinced he had seized control. The faintest smile touched his lips. He thought the point was his. He thought the room was his. But what he didn't realize, what the audience could feel building, was that every insult, every interruption, every smug remark had only dug his hole deeper. He had made himself the villain without Crockett saying a word. And then, with one sentence, the tide began to turn. The room hung in silence, the kind that feels like it's breathing, waiting, pulsing with anticipation. Posner leaned back, smug and certain, convinced his performance had sealed the debate. But Crockett did not rush. She let the silence grow so thick it nearly swallowed his smirk whole. And then, calm, steady, deliberate, she leaned forward. Judge Posner, she began, her voice measured but cutting. It's fascinating that you accuse me of lacking reason while demonstrating exactly what arrogance does to intellect. It blinds it. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. The words landed with surgical precision, cool and undeniable. Posner blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Crockett continued, each phrase paced like a drumbeat. Pause, strike, reaction. You claim law is not about feelings, yet who do you think laws are written for? They aren't for books or theories or ivory towers. They're for people, real people, families, workers, communities. And when judges, cloaked in privilege, dismiss the lived experiences of those people, they don't demonstrate reason. They demonstrate detachment. Gasps now, heads turning, eyes narrowing on Posner, who shifted slightly in his chair. The confidence he once radiated began to look like rigidity, brittle under pressure. Crockett pressed on, sharper now. You speak of nuance, but let's talk about precedent. Because precedent isn't sacred, it's history. And history is full of injustices, once dressed up as law. Slavery was once precedent. Segregation was once precedent. The denial of women's rights, immigrants' rights, workers' rights, all precedent. Precedent alone doesn't make justice. Precedent is only as honorable as the courage of those willing to challenge it. The audience erupted, gasps turning into murmurs of approval. Posner's jaw tightened. His smirk faltered. For the first time, his eyes darted toward the cameras, as though searching for a lifeline. But Crockett wasn't finished. Her voice rose, not in anger, but in conviction, steady, precise, undeniable. You say politics is too blunt to grasp the law. I say the law without humanity is too hollow to serve justice. The Constitution wasn't written for the comfort of elites. It was written as a promise, even if imperfect, that every person counts, that every voice matters. and your condescension toward me, toward anyone who dares to speak outside your narrow corridors of privilege. That's not intellect. That's insecurity dressed up as brilliance. Another wave of applause and gasps. Camera zoomed in on Posner's face, his brows drawn tight, lips pressed thin. He tried to interject, but Crockett didn't flinch, didn't yield. She delivered her next strike like a hammer. You tell me I don't understand precedent, but let me educate you. Precedent bends to courage. It bends to truth, and it bends every single time to those who refuse to be silenced. The room broke into open applause now, people rising to their feet, clapping, cheering. The sound thundered through the chamber, echoing like a verdict handed down by the people themselves. Posner shifted again, visibly rattled. His hand tugged at his glasses, his other fidgeted with a pen. The composure that once looked like dominance now looked like desperation. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply leaned back, calm, unbothered, and let the roar of the crowd carry the weight of her words. But when the noise finally softened, she leaned in once more, her tone quieter, but cutting deeper for its restraint. You tried to humiliate me, Judge. But what you revealed is your own fear that someone like me, someone you never thought worthy of sharing this stage, can dismantle your arrogance not with volume, but with truth. You thought I was here to be your foil. I'm here to be your reckoning. The audience froze, stunned into silence by the sharpness of her words. Then came the eruption, cheers, claps, shouts of affirmation that filled the chamber like thunder rolling over mountains. Posner's face flushed. He forced a laugh, but it rang hollow, brittle. His aura of untouchable intellect was shattered, crumbling under the weight of Crockett's composure. Each rebuttal she had delivered struck harder than the last, turning his arrogance into rubble, his sneers into weakness. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted entirely. What had begun as his stage had become hers. What he thought would be her humiliation became her empowerment. She wasn't just answering his insults. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or talked over by men who mistook cruelty for brilliance. Her final words landed like a gavel slamming down. You wanted a lesson in reason. Here it is. A reason without justice is nothing, and justice without dignity is a lie. That's why your performance here today will be remembered not as a triumph of intellect, but as the collapse of arrogance. The crowd surged again, standing ovation, thunderous applause. Posner sat back, visibly shaken, the smirk gone, replaced by a pallor that no wit could mask. His attempt at dominance had imploded. His aura of superiority lay in ruins. And yet, even as the applause rolled like waves, there was a sense that the true impact had only begun, for while Crockett had won the room, her words were about to echo far beyond its walls. Because the true shockwaves were yet to come. It started with a single clip, 30 seconds of Crockett's voice, calm and commanding, slicing through Posner's sneer. Within minutes, it was everywhere. Phones lit up, timelines flooded, and suddenly the moment was no longer confined to the sterile hearing room. It had become a cultural earthquake. On Twitter, the hashtags trended instantly. Fake Crockett clapback, pot dignity wins, for Posner folded. Memes sprouted overnight. Posner frozen mid, smirk next to Crockett's steady gaze, captioned with lines like "R against a zero, dignity won." Others looped the exact moment his confidence cracked, pairing it with soundtracks from action movies or boxing matches. A TikTok stitched the exchange into montages of David vs. Goliath moments, set to pulsing beats, each one capturing the electricity of a woman standing firm in the face of a so-called giant. Commentators piled on, their tones ranging from glee to awe. One progressive anchor declared, "This wasn't just a debate, it was a takedown for the ages." Crockett showed how intellect and composure can dismantle decades of elitist arrogance. Podcasts replayed her sharpest lines, pausing after each one to let their audiences savor the delivery. Even late-night comedians jumped in, dubbing Posner Professor Pompous and replaying his failed smirk as a running gag. The headlines told the story clearly. Crockett humiliates Posner in viral showdown. Dignity triumphs over elitism. A new political icon emerges. For days, the news cycle couldn't let it go. Cable panels dissected every beat of the exchange. The silence before her words, the crescendo of her rebuttals, the eruption of the crowd. Each analysis only added more oxygen to the firestorm, but the real shockwaves weren't in the punditry. They were in the people. High school and college students clipped her lines and used them as audio for videos about their own struggles. Immigrant kids talking about being underestimated, young women sharing stories of being dismissed by authority figures, workers calling out managers who had belittled them. Crockett's words became a soundtrack for resilience, a shorthand for refusing to bow down. On Instagram, art pages posted digital portraits of her mid-rebuttal, hollowed in light with captions like "Truth Speaks" and "Fearless." A viral TikTok trend invited users to duet with her speech, finishing her sentences with their own declarations of pride and dignity. Overnight, Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a cultural icon. Even her opponents couldn't escape the tide. Conservative voices tried to frame the moment as theatrics, but their clips garnered only mockery. Every attempt to downplay her power only amplified it, fueling the narrative that Posner had been thoroughly dismantled, not just in a hearing, but in the court of public opinion. What startled many was how far the moment reached. International outlets picked it up, headlines in Europe, Asia, Africa, all telling the story of a young black woman in Congress standing tall against a symbol of old guard elitism. Comment sections filled with admiration, with viewers halfway across the world writing, "She speaks for all of us who've been silenced." Crockett herself didn't gloat. She released a short, composed statement the following day. It was never about me versus Judge Posner. It was about reminding people that justice and dignity belong at the center of our debates. That's the America I believe in. The humility only added to her aura, making the contrast with Posner's condescension even sharper. By the end of the week, Crockett's follower count had doubled. Her speeches were being clipped, studied, shared. College debate clubs invoked her name as an example of composure. Activists cited her as proof that courage could triumph over arrogance, that dignity wasn't weakness, it was power. And yet, amid the applause, there lingered a deeper sense of resonance. People weren't just celebrating a viral moment, they were holding on to something bigger, a reminder that truth, wielded with calm conviction, could still shake the foundations of power. Because in the wake of all this, one lesson echoed far beyond the hearing room. The dust had settled, the memes had run their course, and the headlines began to shift to the next scandal of the week. But the echoes of that confrontation lingered deeper than trending hashtags or viral clips. They lived in the minds of those who had watched, replayed, and felt the sting of Posner's arrogance collapse under the weight of Crockett's composure. And it was Crockett herself who gave the moment its truest frame. Speaking days later at a small community gathering, she didn't boast about her victory, nor did she mention Posner's name. Instead, she spoke about dignity. Dignity. She said, her voice firm yet warm, who's in about titles. It isn't about who has the loudest mic or the fanciest resume. Dignity is about knowing who you are, standing on the truth of your lived experience, and refusing to let anyone, no matter how high their perch, strip that away. The room leaned in. She wasn't delivering a takedown now. She was offering a hand, lifting those who felt overlooked. Elitism dresses itself as authority. She continued, but arrogance cannot withstand truth, and truth, when spoken with dignity, will always outlast condescension. The moral began to crystallize. This clash wasn't just about two figures in a hearing room. It was about America itself. The tension between the voices that have long dominated and the voices that have long been dismissed. Crockett's victory symbolized more than a viral moment. It symbolized a shift. America, she reminded the audience, doesn't thrive because of its elites. It thrives because of the underestimated, the immigrants who built its foundations, the workers who power its economy, the activists who bend its laws toward justice, the ordinary people who refuse to stay silent. When those voices stand tall, the nation doesn't just survive, it grows stronger, fairer, truer to its ideals. The narration of her story, echoed by countless commentators and community leaders, reached a crescendo. This wasn't just about a takedown, one wrote. It was about a reminder that power belongs to the people. And when those people speak with dignity, even the loftiest arrogance crumbles. For many, Crockett's moment became a mirror. Viewers saw themselves in her poise, the The student dismissed in class, the worker ignored in meetings, the immigrant questioned for their worth. They saw in her not just a congresswoman, but a living testament that underestimated voices could not only survive in the halls of power, but redefine them. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson. Not that a brilliant judge had been rattled, but that America is still capable of producing leaders who rise not by stepping on others, but by lifting them up. Leaders who prove that sharpness can coexist with empathy, that intellect without arrogance is still the sharpest blade of all. As Crockett's words continued to ripple outward, the narrative hardened into something more enduring than a news cycle, a parable of dignity over arrogance, truth over elitism, justice over detachment. It was a reminder that in a democracy, the final word is never spoken by the self-appointed gatekeepers of power. It is spoken by the people who refuse to be ignored. And in that reminder, a new kind of hope was born. A hope that America's story, for all its fractures, still bends toward dignity. That arrogance, no matter how polished, cannot silence truth spoken with conviction. And that when underestimated voices stand tall, they do more than defend themselves. They redefine what power looks like. Because in the end, this wasn't just Crockett's moment. It was a reminder to every viewer, every citizen, every person told they were less than the fight for dignity is never lost so long as someone is willing to stand and speak. And that lesson, whispered and shouted across the nation, would outlast the smirks, the sneers, and the arrogance of any single man. It would live on as a call to all who had ever been underestimated: stand tall, speak truth, and watch power return to its rightful place back in the hands of the people. What began as an attempted humiliation ended in poetic justice. Posner's smirk, meant to belittle, became the symbol of arrogance undone. Crockett's calm stare, her unwavering composure, became the image of dignity's triumph. The title writes itself. Richard Posner tried to humiliate Jasmine Crockett, but in the end, he was the one destroyed, not by anger, but by truth spoken with grace. And that is why this moment matters. It wasn't just a viral exchange or a headline-grabbing clash. It was proof, living, undeniable proof, that arrogance cannot silence dignity, that no matter how polished the sneer, no matter how high the pedestal, truth will always pierce through. You, the viewer, are part of that victory. Every share, every replay, every word of encouragement extends the ripple of what happened in that room. Crockett stood tall in the face of condescension, but her strength is also yours. Her fight is a reflection of every person who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told they didn't belong. And so the call goes beyond applause. It's a call to stand with dignity wherever arrogance rears its head, to lift up voices that refuse to bow, to remind America that power, real power, belongs not to the smug few, but to the many who speak truth with courage. If you believe, as we do, that dignity will always defeat arrogance, share this video. Subscribe to join a community that refuses to be silenced. And stand with us as we keep telling the stories that prove justice still has a voice, because the fight isn't over. And together, we can make sure it never is.